Hi everyone, it's me, Tim, and today I want to talk about piracy. Doobie Doctor 5000 asks, what are your feelings on video game piracy and anti-piracy DRM measures? Have your colleagues expressed their own views to you on that topic? I'll be honest, we don't really talk about piracy much anymore. I haven't really talked about piracy with colleagues since, I think back in Fallout when we were talking about whether to have DRM on the CD, and I said, that CD is full. There's no way anybody's going to be able to copy 700 meg. Anyway, that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about piracy itself, though. Excuse me. I hear terrible things about piracy. I've been hearing them for decades. People love to say that piracy is costing the industry so much money and it's horrible and undermining everything. I listen. I don't see a lot of evidence for that. In fact, people I know who actually pirated games wouldn't have bought them anyway. Either they didn't have the money or they were pirating kind of just to complete a collection. I know people who just like to collect games. So you're not going to lose a sale if you never would have had a sale. But I will say that I did see piracy of certain games, and I saw why, but I'll talk about that. I think whenever consumers are offered a reason to buy a game, they'll do it. Back when things were physical, pack-in items for fun, maps, especially like cloth maps, coins and other, they called them tchotchkes. Whenever those were packed in to the game box, sales went up. I knew people who would buy the game because they wanted that. I knew people who framed some of those cloth maps. They were fun to get. They were fun to use while you played. I especially liked it when you didn't need the pack-in. It wasn't like there for a copy protection measure. It didn't have like a code on it somewhere. It was just fun to have, but you'd look at it. You'd look at this cloth map and go, I'm going to go here later in the game. Although I will say, a caveat, Fallout used a wire spiral manual, which was really cool because it closed flat. It opened flat. But it was really expensive to do that. I remember there were complaints when we did it, and then for Fallout 2, it was completely taken off the table. So that's why Fallout 2 had a manual that was bound. Now that things are digital, I don't think piracy is as big of a deal because A, it's super easy to buy a game. And two, if you go through those library channels, or those streaming services, you get this nice library that you don't have to keep a bunch of discs on your shelf. You don't have to manage where these are kept. It's just you have an account at Steam or GOG or Epic, and there are all the games you've ever bought. And you can download them, play them, wipe them locally, and you still own them. It's nice. I think once things like that happen, people stopped worrying about piracy because people are willing to pay if paying gives you the best product and a lot of services. And that gets me to the problem I always had with anti-piracy measures is it usually hurt the valid consumer more than the pirate. I mean, back when I had my Atari, they used to do things like put bad sectors on floppy disks and then try to read that sector. And if it could, it knew it was a pirated game because it was, how do you write a bad sector? Although pirates quickly figured out how to write a bad sector by adjusting the speed of their floppy drive during writes. I mean, it wasn't hard. But what happens is if you make a game that runs slower or takes longer to start up or whatever, it will become unplayable if someone loses a piece of paper or a color wheel disc. You're going to drive valid consumers away from your product. Whether they buy it or not, or whether they pirate it or not, they're not going to buy it. Because once someone pirates and they have wiped those measures, if the game's better because of it, if it runs faster, has a better frame rate, doesn't pause occasionally, starts up really fast, why would you want to play the valid one? And also, when I mentioned that color wheel disc, my first year at Interplay, I went to go play a game they were using a anti-piracy measure. It was a color wheel. You had to match symbols And you not only had to match the correct symbol, but you had to match the correct color of the symbol, and I couldn't do it. I remember after several tries to get that color wheel working, I went down to the executive producer's office and just ranted. And he didn't believe me. He was like, "You're not colorblind. You can see that." And I was like, "I'm not red green. I'm whole spectrum, and I can't play this game." And it was super frustrating. And what's odd about it, I could have just hacked it trivially to make, no matter what you typed in as the symbols that matched, it would report that as fine. In fact, that was a trivial change. I tried to explain that to a lot of people who were really pro anti-piracy measures of how trivial they were to circumvent, but no one cared. Also, I would like to point out that there are several games that survive now because of piracy. Games that shipped on floppies and the companies don't exist anymore, and the original like source code and stuff like that is lost to time. If the only copies around were floppies, those floppies have all decayed by now. The only reason there are some games around that are still playable is because someone pirated them and either moved it to a hard drive or put it up on the net. And I'm not saying that's justifying piracy. I'm just saying piracy isn't all bad. There are some games out there I know of that only exist because the pirated version was out there. Okay, so people complain also, though, about, hey, I wish we had more games like this one. People say that about some of my older games, and they didn't sell well. And I can tell you, piracy may not have been the cause of them not selling well, but it certainly didn't help. There are a lot of my older games that are cult classics. They didn't sell well, and they were pirated a lot. And if you were one of the people who did that, and now you're complaining, how can we get more games like that? It's really hard to get a new publishing deal when they look at your previous games, sales figures, and go, nah, those aren't very good. Now, for my games, there were a lot of other reasons they didn't ship. Bugginess, shipping incomplete, and all that. But I'm just saying, don't justify piracy with that. Piracy didn't help. However, having said all that stuff, I'm more worried about a lot of other things in the industry now. I mean, piracy doesn't even make, I want to say it doesn't make my top 10. I don't even think it's on my list. If I would say that the things you should be worried about in the industry right now, there's probably two big things. One, there are too many hands in the pie of when a game makes money, who takes that money. Publishers take a big chunk of it, and they say, well, we supplied the capital, we took the risk. I see a lot of developers go under. They seem to be taking a lot more risk. But now, in addition to publishers, you have whoever is doing the digital sales, whether it's Steam or Epic or GOG or whatever, they take a chunk. If you used a game engine like Unity or Unreal, they take a chunk. So there are so many hands in that pie that what finally gets into the developer's hands is much smaller than it used to be. And because there's so many games coming out, the giant game industry pie, which is way bigger than it used to be, is being sliced into tinier slices anyway. Another concern I have, which is just about game developers themselves and not game development companies, because most companies do not have any provisions for giving royalties to developers, you end up with a state of the industry which has a lot of negative effects for you, the consumer. One, individual developers don't feel a lot of loyalty anymore to companies because, especially with work from home, I just go wherever the salary's higher because I can't rely. There's nothing attaching me to the success of the game I make. If it goes out and does really well, it doesn't like it affects me much. Yeah, it makes my resume look better for going to other companies, but it usually doesn't affect me much at the company I'm at. Also, when people are considering going into the game industry versus other industries, I remember back in the 90s and early 2000s, a lot of 3D artists were saying, oh, it's stupid to go into the game industry. You'll get paid more in the movie industry. And we lost a lot of really, really, really good 3D artists to the movie industry. Movies started looking better. Took a while for the game industry to recover from that. Same thing I see happening now with narrative designers. Narrative designers get nothing if their game does well. But if they wrote that same thing as a screenplay for a movie and the movie gets made, they get royalties for that. So the fact that unions exist to support that in Hollywood is a big thing. And I don't want to do a whole union thing. I'm talking about piracy here, but I'm just saying when individuals think about going to the game industry, this is the kind of stuff they think about. Is there anything in this for me long term? Is there any reason I need to be loyal to a company or even to a product I just made? If I worked on a game that did well, I could probably make more money by jumping to another company and getting an increased salary there or an increased position, jumping from senior to lead. So I've always thought that royalties were a good way of trying to keep people at the company they were at and to reward them for what they did, which is why, because Troika got royalties from the publisher for Arcanum, since Sierra gave us royalties, we took half of those royalties and rolled them into the next game, and the other half we split evenly between the developers who made Arcanum. So that's what I thought was a great way of doing it. It's like, hey, if you want this game to do well, programmer, artist, designer, because if it does well and royalties come in, you get a chunk of that. I thought that was the perfect mesh, but we couldn't get that deal on any subsequent contract, and Sierra started saying because of cost of goods they didn't know us any more royalty, and that all just fell away. So I'm not saying it's a perfect plan, but I think it's better than what's going on right now. Anyway, piracy's bad. I don't think it's nearly as bad as what people say it is, and I think there's far worse things to worry about than that. So I hope that answers your question, Doobie Doctor.